And the reason that we're doing this podcast is because we know that there's so many people that are out there that are listening that are trying to navigate this cultural moment that we're living in right now as Christians, as believers. You can have a thriving faith in Babylon. We talked about that, like Daniel and his friends grew a thriving faith in Babylon.
God really spoke to me through a worship service, and he said, I need you to be doing this the rest of your life for me. And I just knew in that moment.
So we left Liberia, a war broke out, we lost all of our stuff, and then we moved to this tiny little country called Kuwait, nobody had ever heard of. Hey, welcome to episode 8 of the podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Graham, and I am here with the lovely Amy Graham, my wife,
everybody.
Pastor here at District Church. We have the privilege of serving here at the District Church in the heart of our nation's capital. And today's episode is brought to you by Capitol Hill Pest Control. They are going around and helping you.
Is that real? Oh my gosh.
I'm just kidding. We actually don't have any sponsors.
What in the world?
I just thought that was... You know how they always do like
I know.
commercials at the beginning of podcasts?
Though. I didn't think we had any sponsors.
Didn't you like that? We don't have sponsors.
We don't have sponsors.
But if we did, it would probably be some group like Capitol Hill Pest Control.
Really?
I don't know.
I would not think that.
I was trying to think of something really local and small.
Oh, okay.
I don't even think that group exists, but they probably should because there are a lot of pests
in DC,
on Capitol Hill, literally and figuratively.
Well, that is absolutely true.
There's a lot of rats. For those of you who are not from DC, if you live in the urban core, you will see rats on a regular basis.
You will.
And
they're very, very smart, and they are very resilient.
They are very resilient. Speaking of resilient, that's our theme today.
I know.
We want to talk to you guys today about growing a resilient faith. That's really what this podcast is all about, is how you can be in the world and not of the world. And there are external forces, namely the enemy, and how the enemy manifests in culture that tries to get you to weaken and water down your faith. But there's also internal struggles we deal with that the enemy uses to try to get us to weaken or water down our faith. And our real heart and passion, and the reason that we're doing this podcast, is because we know that there's so many people that are out there that are listening that are trying to navigate this cultural moment that we're living in right now as Christians, as believers. And so, we grew up in a time period where the majority of people in America identified as Christians. It, increased your social standing, maybe just even a little bit, to be identified as a Christian. People would ask you, where do you go to church? And the question usually wasn't if you went to church, but where you went to church. There was social pressure around that. All of that is gone now. Yeah. And almost regardless of where you live in the U.S. It used to be like in the urban core cities like D.C., but now it's happening everywhere. And one of the reasons we started this podcast was to help those who are experiencing the culture that we've been living in here in D.C. for a couple decades now. Mm-hmm. And really trying to help folks understand that you actually can grow in your faith. You can have a thriving faith in Babylon. We talked about that, like Daniel and his friends grew a thriving faith in Babylon. So I would really love today to kind of unpack our stories a little bit for those who are new listening, wanting to get to know our stories a little bit more and why we do what we do and why we're so committed around this theme of resilience. So Amy, share with us something that you went through growing up that challenged or tested your faith, something that you had to be resilient. And I think most people would agree when they see Amy Graham, the word resilience describes you. Resilience is the ability to bounce back quickly from setbacks or adversity. And I think that that's something that marks your life. It marks your ministry. But you've had to develop that muscle over time. So tell us about something difficult you went through growing up.
Well, I experienced a lot of loneliness growing up because for the first 4 years of schooling that I went to, kindergarten through third grade, I changed schools 3 times. And so I had to change friend groups. I had to change environments and, teachers and different things in a way that most kids didn't have to. And I think that created a resilience in me to like bounce back from difficulty and challenge and engage with new people in different ways. But it also created a lot of loneliness because it was harder to sustain relationships when you're bouncing around all the time. In addition to the loneliness that I encountered within the school environment, I was also really passionate about my faith, even as a little kid. And the environments that I was in, there just wasn't that same vibrancy or dedication to faith and commitment to faith. So that created a little bit of loneliness for me, or separation from the rest of the community, the rest of the world. And I tried to push in different ways, but I think that challenge definitely emboldened my faith. It encouraged my faith. And along with just some medical challenges I had growing up, had a pretty major surgery at 19 years old that was an emergency surgery. And those things led to future things that impacted my life and the ability to have children and things like that. And so through all of the things I encountered, God was always present. And my faith was the rock that kept me grounded and kept me steady in the midst of everything that I encountered, whether it was the loneliness of not having community and a strong faith community, or having really medical challenges that impacted me for life in many different ways.
Let's zero in on that a little bit more, because we both grew up Baptist, and Baptists really emphasize that you make your own decision for Christ.
Sure.
I remember the critique of predestination. We focus on free will, right, in the Baptist. But as I hear more of your story, and as you talk about even your younger years and how God called you at a younger age, I'm like, that sounds like God predestined you for ministry. Like He got a hold of your life even at a young. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, the story that I often say is that when I was 4 years old and I was at my babysitter's, there was a bunch of us there that would stay there while my parents worked. And I would call everybody together underneath the dining room table of the babysitter's house, and I would be the preacher, and we would have church underneath the table. And so from a very, very young age, I felt like this desire to preach the gospel, or to at least teach others about Jesus. And I do believe that it was a gift from the Lord. Like, I believe faith is a gift, and I'm so grateful that I was able to experience that at an early age, and really, embrace it, cultivate it, and grow in it. And I think that the challenges that I experienced helped make my faith more resilient over the years.
I would have loved to be in your congregation.
I was a really good preacher at 4.
That would have been awesome.
But Aaron, I want to hear how.
Well, no. Now, before you get to me, I'm interested to hear more about how then you navigated loneliness and your strong faith. When did you feel called to ministry? When did you first sense like, no, I think I want to spend my life doing church and gospel ministry?
So it was when I was like 16 years old. I was on a mission trip, and we were serving some poor in an Appalachian context. I grew up in Appalachia, but there were people who were in a more difficult environment than I was in, and we were serving them. And through that environment, God really spoke to me through a worship service. And He said, I need you to be doing this the rest of your life for me. And I just knew in that moment. I didn't have a lot of knowledge or people around me who were educated in the realm of ministry and to guide me very well. So I just kind of had to figure it out on my own. So the loneliness that I experienced, it felt like isolation in some ways when it came to navigating what I needed to navigate. But God always led me to the right people that led me to the right next step. for instance, I was serving as a worship leader for this ministry that I had been called to the Lord, or called to ministry in. I was serving out on the West Coast, and the people that I was serving with, after they heard my desire to go to seminary after college, they were like, oh, you need to go to this seminary. And I had never even heard about it before.
Yeah.
And it was all the way in California. So coming from a small town in West Virginia, I just was like, okay, God, this must be you. And so I applied, never even visited. I just flew out there to attend school.
To San Francisco.
Which people...
Which everybody warned was such a godless city.
They were like, I don't know if they even believe in Jesus out there. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that at the seminary they do. So I just trusted the Lord in that.
Yeah.
And I think that God really honored my trust in him by carrying me to that place.
Well, I love your resilience, that your faith in Christ was so strong that even when you went through so many times of testing, you always knew God's call in your life and you went through it. I mean, I grew up my parents are missionaries and pastors, so I grew up in the church all the time. So when I expressed a calling to ministry, and then when I went on mission trips and raised money, there was just that support built in. But you grew up small town, West Virginia, a woman called to ministry in the Southern Baptist context, going to seminary in San Francisco. You were really a trailblazer in so many ways. And one of the things I love about you is how your faith is so real and personal and not dependent on other people.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what we need in our culture today, because you're not always going to be in a place or a situation where you're going to have community around you. We look at church history, there's a lot of times people get, locked up for their faith. And it's if your faith is not strong enough, if you haven't taught yourself how to feed yourself spiritually, if you're always dependent on others. And I love that about you. Yeah. I think it's easy for people to see your resilience now today, but that started at a young age.
It did. But everybody's story is so unique. And so I even think with your experience growing up as a missionary kid or in a pastor's family, you have your own experience of your faith being built up and resilient. So share with us more about that.
Yeah, I think some of the things I experienced at a young age that really challenged or tested my faith were, well, first off, the first 6 years of my life, I lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and my dad was the chaplain at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. We always get asked to give now at the gas stations and grocery stores to St. Jude. Incredible mission, but my dad started the chaplaincy there and was walking with families whose kids had been diagnosed with cancer. And at that time in the early 80s, most children died of cancer, even at St. Jude's. And so my dad was carrying that trauma of having walked with hundreds of families who had lost their young children to cancer. But then my parents felt called to move to this little country in West Africa called Liberia that had been founded by freed slaves. And we were missionaries there. And I remember the first year I was there, we would often hike to the villages on Saturdays. That was special time with my dad. We'd hike to the villages and we'd take a little bit of food. And I remember this one young baby named Masa, who was about 6 months old, but she was malnourished. And I was always thinking and asking about her. I was always like, we got to go on this next Saturday. We got to take food to her. And I remember doing that for several months and then finding the next week when we went that she had actually passed away, that she had died, and she had died of hunger. And so you can imagine me at 6 years old having met a child who died of a preventable cause and the guilt that I had.
The trauma.
Yeah. Of just seeing oh my gosh, this kid died, because in the village, the adults eat first. Kids get the leftovers. Yeah. And so it was just super sad. And then to move to, we left Liberia, a war broke out. We lost all of our stuff. Yeah. And then we moved to this tiny little country called Kuwait, nobody had ever heard of. 3 months later, Saddam Hussein invades and we were held hostage, me for 6 weeks, my dad for 4 months. And when we got back and then settled in Richmond, Virginia, I had to really wrestle with all of this poverty and suffering that I had experienced. And I had to make a decision whether the trauma that I had experienced being around war, the suffering that I experienced and seeing poverty, whether that was going to cause me to isolate or to engage.
Yeah.
And as I got older and I began to realize things such as, and this was in the 90s, that 30,000 kids die every day of preventable causes.
Yeah.
30,000 kids die every day of preventable causes. And that became my life mission. I remember my college applications, sharing my story and being like, hey, my dream was always to lead an organization like World Vision or Compassion. Guys, I just felt like, wow, they're doing this in the name of Jesus. They're literally saving lives. And it wasn't until I was older and realized that those organizations exist because the local church isn't doing the work.
Sure.
And
absolutely.
they need to exist on that scale. But the local church is really where it's happening. And, but anyway, so just moving towards the suffering of the world. And, now a couple decades later, I don't know what the latest number is, but it might be 10,000 kids die every day of preventable causes. And that's been greatly reduced. And that's the power of the church coming together. But it was a difficult first 10 years of my life.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
I had to learn how to be resilient. I had to learn to get into therapy and counseling and process this. We were even talking last night on date night. We were having this little flashback to when I took you to Kuwait a few years ago.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
And we took the whole family.
Yes.
And I wanted to tell you guys the story and go visit some
We
of the
got in
places.
really, really late.
Yeah.
None of us speak Arabic. I'm learning right now, but we didn't speak any then.
Yeah.
And no one there speaks English very well.
Yeah.
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 So it was tough.
It was tough. It was definitely tough. Well, I remember we got out from the airport. I'm too cheap to arrange nice travel. So we just go to the taxi stand and we need to get to the hotel, and we get in the car, and they drive very fast in Kuwait.
They do.
I
didn't know that
limits
until
are
we
not
got
enforced. And I remember that a little bit from back in the day. But I remember being totally traumatized in that car ride. And I actually didn't even realize it until we were talking last night that oh my gosh, I remember that car ride to the hotel so vividly because he was flying. We didn't speak the language. And the last time that I had been in a car
in Kuwait,
I had an AK-47 in my back when an Iraqi soldier. And I was like, wow. But how healing it was to go back to the place, to take you and Elijah and Natalie to the place where our house was broken into that day, and to see the gospel still going forward at this little international church in the heart of Kuwait City. And so I share all that, and we share all that because I know somebody's listening right now who's in the middle of something, in the middle of being tested in some way. And when you look throughout history of the people who become great leaders, if you look at people who grow a resilient faith, every one of us goes through hard things in our life, but it's how we respond to those things that really make a difference. And that's why being in the context of Christian community with others where you can process this, because the enemy loves to get in and create confusion and cause us to believe lies when we're in the middle of a hard season. Yeah. And those hard seasons are not always confined to our childhood, but they continue to our adult years. Yeah. And so we get married. We're both called to ministry at a young age. We both had these childhood experiences of ways we've had to be resilient. And I think it's one of the reasons we met and got married so quickly is because our values were so similar, and our callings were so similar, and our sense of identity apart from each other was so strong. And so we got married. We're celebrating 21 years this year, but we got married and we experienced challenges in our marriage. It wasn't enough just to be like, oh, we're Christian, we're attracted to each other, let's get married. Talk to us about some of those challenges that required us to be resilient.
We know, most people know opposites attract, and our personalities are very different, but we are both very strong-willed and have very strong convictions and callings individually, which is a huge gift and a blessing. And I think God has done many things through our commitment to one another and our marriage with one another for his kingdom, which has always been my hope, right? Like we have seen God do amazing things for his kingdom purposes because we decided to say yes to one another, which is a huge gift. And it doesn't come without challenges because I'm very much a challenger when it comes to things, and I do like autonomy. You're very much an achiever, and you like to make things happen. And those things are often conflicting.
So let's talk about some of that. How did that come up in our first few years of marriage where, opposites attract? But then the opposite things that attract you then become, once you experience the safety of marriage, begin to be the things that can repel you if you're not careful. And, so it's here's this strong, independent woman who has this strong sense of self. And now we're married and she doesn't need me as much as I want her to need me, if that makes sense.
It's true.
And things like we realize, like how, for instance, I am much more touchy-feely than you are, right? Like, so I want to be together, like quality time, physical touch. Those are my love languages. And so it's like our daughter, Natalie, she wants to hug like 20 times a day. I'm like the same way.
Right.
But
it's good you have each other.
So, share some of the things that were challenging around how different, I am than you are, and how you learn to navigate that.
Well, I think as it relates to our faith and having a resilient faith, it's like we both felt very called to doing what God had called us to do. And I think the trickiest part is navigating how we can be one another's biggest cheerleaders, but also draw one another back together when necessary, and really discerning in the spirit what role we're playing when. Because I think you're amazing and brilliant, and I want the world to know more of who you are and experience that. But when I am only cheering you on in that way, then our family suffers because then you're out there and not with us. And so we have to figure out and navigate that balance of cheering you on and being excited about what God is doing in your life and being your biggest cheerleader, while also saying, hey, we're still a family unit. God's still doing things through our family and in our family that we need to be focused on. So I think that, and vice versa, you doing that with me, that has probably been one of the biggest things that we're still navigating. We're still trying to figure out what that looks like.
Because one of our strengths is that we're both called to ministry. And so this is our world. And yet one of the challenges is that we're both called to ministry. It's not like, one of us just is in the help role and the other person is doing all this and I'm behind the scenes doing everything. And it's like, no, we're equally called to ministry. How do we navigate that? I remember a really challenging moment we went through between when we were dating and when we were married, where you really sensed a strong calling to France and to Europe, and really wanting to move there. And I remember I actually persisted through several years of marriage and just feeling this like burden. In fact, you were, before we met, after seminary, on your way to get trained to move to France to be a missionary for 2 years. And then 9/11 happened and redirected you to New England. Praise God. That's where I met you. I wouldn't have met you if it hadn't been for that. But we really struggled with that. And I really remember, because I'm like, I ain't called to Europe. Europe's so secular. Oh my gosh, this is like, that's like the hardest place, And we really wrestled. And I remember like crying out to God in prayer early in our marriage, being like, God, I know that you would not call me and Amy together in marriage and then call us to separate places. Like, because we're praying to the same God. We're following the same God. So maybe it's around timing, and oftentimes we joke that God speaks to you first, before he speaks to me. But then we found our place. We found this calling to serve the least of these in Boston, and to serve college students in Boston. And then we found this calling to move to DC. And even the first 3 years in DC were harder on our marriage because we were actually doing separate jobs. And then when we planted the district church, it began to intersect our lives even more.
Yeah.
But is there anything else you remember from our marriage of just how we've been challenged, or maybe what rhythms have we developed in our marriage that have allowed us to counteract this kind of individualistic, strong-willed streak that each of us have?
I mean, one of the things that we have strongly protected is trying to have a date night every week.
Every week.
I shouldn't say trying to, but we have
We
a
do.
date night every week.
We
for
replace
many
it
years.
when we have to, like when something has to happen on Monday night, we'll reschedule it another night.
And we get a babysitter. We've budgeted for that, and it's not always an extravagant thing, but it's time set aside for us to focus on one another and our relationship and talk through a lot of different things. So that's something that we've committed to, and that's something that I encourage other couples to do as well.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, we have very open communication. We don't typically let things be swept under the rug.
Yeah.
We want to talk things out. We share how we feel. We've learned a lot about what it means to own our own feelings, but bring them to one another and say, this is what I'm dealing with. This is what I'm experiencing. And so all of that open communication and talking through things allows us to just be more connected and stay on the same path together.
Yeah.
We love to laugh together.
Yeah.
Watching comedians is one of my favorite things, and I've let you come into that space with me. And so I think that there's several different ways that we've tried to go together. I don't know, what would you say that we do that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things is just being in community with other couples, because I think whenever you're going through something hard in marriage, you can think, oh my gosh, I'm the only one that's dealing with this. I got to not talk about this. And finding other couples that can help normalize or signal that actually this is an issue, you need to address it. And, something some folks might not know is that for, 10 years, your primary role here in the church was counseling. And most of that was pre-marriage and marital counseling. And then you raised up a whole team to help lead the counseling center here. But you walked, you said something like 10,000 hours that went into your marriage surrendered class that you did a video series on recently, which, by the way, check out marriagesurrendered.com. Is that right? Yeah. Marriagesurrendered.com. It's a 7-week discipleship curriculum.
Or 7 sessions.
7 sessions designed to help equip you either if you're preparing to get married or if you already are married, or you're seriously dating even. But I remember how many couples you'd met with, I think over 10,000 hours. And so whenever we were going through something, it's like you had a benchmark to know, like, oh no, this is actually very common.
Yes.
Like, we need not freak out about this. Like, it's a tension to be managed rather than resolved. And then there are certain things that come up that you're like, no, you got to run to this and you've got to resolve it quickly. And I think just being in Christian community with other people that share your values. And one of the big things that we have happening in our culture today is that people are in community with other couples who don't share their values.
Yeah.
And so there's a couple struggling in their marriage, and here in DC, things like open marriages have become norm, which is totally unchristian, totally unbiblical, where people experiment outside of marriage because the sexual ethic of today has been reduced to, as long as it is consensual among 2 adults, then it's fine. So as long as it's consensual among, 2 married people, then, whatever you agree to is fine. That kind of stuff is destroying marriages today. And so you have to be careful and discerning. But I praise God for, the couples, even in our church, that have helped sharpen and encourage us, in our marriage as well. Let's talk finally real quick about parenting. How have you developed a resilient faith in parenting?
Well, we have a unique experience in parenting in that we also went through the adoption process, which everybody's experience in becoming parents is their own journey and their own story. But being adoptive parents creates an opportunity for a different kind of experience, because no matter how your children come to you, in the adoption story, there's always some level of trauma present. And just even the journey to adopt was already challenging. We had our first adoption fall through, and then we were able to adopt Elijah not too long after that. But just the journey to adopt is challenging. But, both of our kids struggle with special needs. Both of them have medical needs that have require attention. And so God has really allowed our faith to be refined.
Yeah.
Like refined in the fire.
Totally.
As we have parented our kids.
Mm-hmm.
And there have just been really hard moments where trauma has reared its ugly head, and we've had to deal with it. And I feel grateful for the way that God has equipped us to deal with these different things.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, it's been hard.
It's been hard. Yeah. I mean, just as a father who feels the weight of providing for your kids and navigating this call that both of us have to ministry, which does not have a financial guarantee. You live by faith. We start new things. And so we've always taken great risks financially to do the things that God's called us to do, and then have the expense of adoption, and then have the expense of special needs children, and then have the expense of schooling, because we're big advocates of public school, but that did not work out for our kids. Their needs needed private education, and to experience that. And then to be able to look back now, our kids are teenagers, and to see how the Lord has provided for us, like Jehovah Jireh, our provider. And yet it would be very easy when adoptions fall through, when the expenses go higher, to just be like, I guess I'm not called to do that. That must be, and it's like, no. Like, if the early church waited to have the funding and to wait till things weren't hard, like, they would have never done what they've done, you know. And our faith grows stronger when we're actually in difficult times.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, Amy, as we close, share with us what you have done, or some rhythms you do to help put your own suffering within context, right?
Sure.
Like the hard things you've gone through in your life. How do you maintain perspective?
Well, one of the ways, as the pastor that oversees outreach at our church, is that I try to really stay connected to our partners and know what's going on with them. And, you know, my role on our staff is to really oversee those that are our partners in the Middle East. And so any way that I can connect with them and hear what's going on with them, and especially right now, there's been so much suffering, so much war that's been happening. And what I know is that the more connected that I am to people who, especially Christians, so Palestinian Christians who have gone through some of the most difficult oppression, being under occupation, just the racism that they experience on the daily, and yet their faith is steadfast and resilient and strong. It is such a testimony to me of God's power at work in the midst of such challenge. And it's also convicting for me as a follower of Jesus to try to get outside of my comfort zone and really empathize with their life. And it strengthens my faith. To be able to see what God is doing in their faith, in their context.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that we're committed to doing on this podcast, is telling you stories of Christians who have learned to persevere and be resilient in their faith, to bounce back quickly from setbacks and from adversity. And so that's one of the things I love doing on here, is interviewing people like Pastor Diodne on our last episode, who just talks about overcoming losing his parents, rebuilding a country from war and all the trauma. And so we'll keep bringing you that content here, but I want to encourage you to get connected with the needs of your community, the needs of the world. Some churches call it the missions team, or outreach, or external engagement, whatever it's called. You need to be serving outside of the walls of your church, preferably with other Christians, so that it can put your light and momentary troubles into perspective. And that's the example we find in Jesus, that he went to the cross and he overcame our sin, and he built a bridge to us, to the Father, so that we could have eternal life, so that whatever we're experiencing here on this earth could be put into an eternal perspective, and we would be filled with this Holy Spirit and be able to move toward the suffering of the world, just as Jesus moved towards us. Thanks for joining us on episode 8. Thank you, Amy, for being with us today. And so great to have you guys join us. If this blessed you in some way, Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and let other people know that this exists. Take care.
Thank you so much for listening today. We hope that you were blessed by the Lord and this message, and we would love for you to connect with us more. You can find out more about us at districtchurch.org.